Tell us a little bit about Feleman and the types of investments that you manage.
Yeah, so I've been in Web3 for quite a period of time, for the last 7 years as a builder, and along the way, just found opportunities to invest in the space initially just through relationships. And prior to actually getting to Web3, I was more of a fintech investor. That's kind of my investment life. Started off investing in a mobile payments company about 12 years ago in Sierra Leone. And along the way, happened into Bitcoin and Ethereum, began to kind of dig into Web3. And at some point, I just felt it was the future of financial services. But beyond that, I just thought Web3 is going to be the future of how human beings collaborate. And so, I kind of shifted and pivoted almost 100% from fintech investing into Web3, right? Because I just felt that, and especially coming from an African context, I just felt that Web3 provided just a number of assurances and tools that we don't quite have in emerging markets like sub-Saharan Africa. And so because I was building in the space at the cutting edge, I felt I had also an edge in terms of seeing how the space was developing. And so it made sense to sort of pivot into Web3 full time.
Once you go down that Web3 wormhole, it's kind of hard to get out, right? Once you start working, building, and seeing the solutions available. And, you actually were an angel investor in Afropolitan. What was it about Afropolitan that caught your eye and made you want to invest in this project?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is, I'd heard about Afropolitan from different people who were investing. I knew a number of the players, right? It's sort of being in the African investment ecosystem, you sort of know names and faces. But when I had a conversation with Eche about Afropolitan, for me, one of the big things was the vision, right? So sort of having, grown up in Nigeria, but spent most of my adult life in the US, right? You sort of see a lot of dislocations, right? On challenges that particularly affect, Africans, African Americans, Africans in diaspora, whether we live in our own countries or live elsewhere. And to me, the Afropolitan vision was sort of the first time that I felt, okay, here's a holistic approach to trying to solve multiple problems, right? And so if you're kind of like thinking about solving like the problems from a first principle standpoint, I'm like, okay, this is really interesting, right? And they're taking a kind of like a very holistic approach to thinking about, how would we establish a global country from day one if we could build it from scratch? So that was the first thing that was really big. But the other thing too was a lot of the investors in the seed round were a lot of people I knew, and people who have been building in the space in fintech and entrepreneurs. Like it was almost kind of like an all-star team of builders and investors in the space. And for me, that was like, all right, everyone's in here, like, right? And so there was just this sense of, okay, if this is going to be successful, like everyone who needs to be in the tent is already in the tent. And so I didn't want to kind of be left out. To be very honest, I'm like, okay, this is something that I can invest time and resources into.
And let our viewers know, along with the amount of people who are investing, what are some of the things in Web3? What are some of the tools in Web3 that solve the problems that you've seen growing up in Nigeria, and also some of the problems you see going forward in the future?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things, right? So I think fundamentally, so the biggest issue and problem is that, to a large extent, the global financial system as it exists today puts Africans at a huge disadvantage, wherever you might be. So when you look at sub-Saharan Africans in our own countries, we're subject to the rules of the game that's set by dollar dominance of global finance, right? So the dollar is the global reserve currency. The U.S. basically can set a lot of the rules, right, of how things actually work out and pick winners and losers. And when you look at sub-Saharan Africa in total, we end up being at the short end of the stick, where a lot of our economies are looked at as extractive economies, right? Get raw materials. And to a large extent, in my view, sub-Saharan Africa subsidizes the rest of the world, because the way the rules of the game have been established, resources can be gotten on the cheap, and all the value add is done offshore. And so someone else is capturing the majority of the upside, right, of our resources, right? We have to depend on a banking and financial system where our central banks don't really have a lot of control on the value of our currencies, even if you have great governance, right? Some decision by the Fed, some decision by a global financial body can negate all your efforts, right? So that's kind of one huge issue, right? How do we kind of have an option or a way to opt out of the current global financial system, which does not really service us, right? But then when you extrapolate out, you now think about, you know, I think sub-Saharan Africa, depending on what stats you look at, brings in about 50 to 70 billion dollars of remittances annually, right? But it's the most expensive place to move money into and around, right? So on average, remittance costs are about 10% of all the value going back. So if you're making an assumption that it's $60 billion being sent home, someone is just basically taking $6 billion off the top for very little value add. Particularly in the global world we are today, where on Web3, right, you can get low cost peer-to-peer transfers. And so those are two big issues in terms of financial services. But beyond that too, just the way Africans are treated and, the way our passports are even treated in different countries, right? If you travel on a Nigerian passport, there are all sorts of assumptions made about who you are. If you're transacting on the internet and paying for things, like I've been in situations where I've gone home and tried to access my bank accounts and they've been frozen just because of my IP address. And when you look at the facts in terms of global fraud or financial fraud, Africa is not nowhere near on the top of the list. So why are we being treated like, we're the cause of all these global problems? So when you think about all those financial services, which kind of form the basis of creating wealth, driving wealth, we don't control any of the rules. And so for me, Web3 as a whole gives us an opportunity to enter a permissionless financial system, right? Have the ability to transact where many people couldn't transact before, right? And kind of build wealth, store wealth like everyone else, right? So I think to me, those are some of the core issues. And then beyond that, when you start thinking about the mission of Afropolitan around bringing together the diverse diaspora, right? So I think people sometimes assume that, the African diaspora is only Black, but that's not really true, right? The African diaspora is Arab, it's Indian, it's white, right? And so part of that mission is how do we bring everyone together and united around a shared vision, right? And I think oftentimes we're sort of fractured, right? People are kind of doing their own thing. And so for me, this opportunity was in Web3, we can come together on a whole new financial system and just kind of think about and have more control in terms of our destiny and our future.
Oh, man. Amazing explanation there. And I'm glad you stated, some of the things that the problems that you can solve. These things were not available before Web3 because you always had some sort of central control. And now that we've basically created a decentralized world, we can take advantage of that. And how do we get people to understand that this is something that they can take part in? What are some of the educational tools or some of the ways that we can market this to people in the African diaspora so that they can be involved?
Yeah, so I think this is really an interesting point. When you look at the adoption of Web3, like Nigeria is always in the top 3 in terms of adoption. And some of the reasons were for what I stated earlier on, where in the current global financial system, access to banking services is difficult if you don't have an identity, if you don't have a bank account. And even when you have access, it's very expensive, right? And there are other hurdles you have to kind of jump through, right? And so when you're looking at the adoption of Web3, the uptake is extremely high in countries like Nigeria, because Nigeria also is very import dependent, right? So there are many businesses that depend on bringing goods from abroad. And in order to do that, you need the dollar to kind of pay for your goods and services. So now you're seeing a lot of people over the years migrate to Web3 because there was access, because I can access stable coins, right? I can pay for my services. I can pay for my goods that are coming to the country, and I can run a business, right? And so those are like some kind of interesting things that we're seeing happening, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that now can kind of create a bridge whereby the diaspora can now realize, well, oh, okay, right, I can send stable coins home rather than using the banking system to send money home. And it's cheaper, it's faster, I can do it more frequently. And there are less people in between me and that transactions, right? So there are less opportunities for those transactions to fail for whatever arbitrary reasons, right? So it's a lot more secure, it's more accessible. So I think the opportunity really, in my view, is that we're seeing a lot of innovation around Web3 happen in the places where it's needed the most, right? And so part of the challenge is how do you create greater visibility as to these opportunities in the diaspora, right? And how do you also just communicate that? I think a lot of the challenge is right? The Western media is dominated by a Western perspective. And so a lot of these things are actually captured in Western media. A lot of people don't know what's going on and how the adoption rate and what the use cases are in sub-Saharan Africa. So some of it is just really having the ability to communicate those things, right? And being sort of like a big enough united group that can kind of have that voice and kind of highlight those opportunities in terms of what's going on, where the innovation's happening, and ideally then also bring funding to support that, right? I think part of the challenge of Web3 is there's capital that's been accumulated in different buckets that are typically Westernized, but a lot of in my view, most interesting innovation is happening in emerging markets. So how do you bridge that gap where those who have the funds, right, are aligned philosophically with those who have the need? And how do we start kind of getting investment in and having these conversations move away from, right, some of what we hear in the West around speculation to some of the more real use cases where in sub-Saharan Africa, like crypto is used as a settlement currency for billions of dollars of transactions daily, right? That people need to be aware of that. And I think once the awareness is there, then we can start kind of moving the conversation to more constructive things.
Yes, and I definitely think the Western media does a terrible job of sort of outlining how crypto is really used. It's more about clicks and about views, but not really about the information. And because of that, I think you stated it, hit the nail on the head, that people don't have the correct information about how this can be used. And I must say, Afropolitan as a digital country is an amazing idea. Do you think there will be other iterations of this idea in other parts of the world? And will you be willing to build the bridge between Afropolitan and some of the other different innovations that may happen in the Web3 space?
Oh, yeah. So I think that's, at least from my perspective, I think that's a massive opportunity where if we can, part of the goal of Afropolitan is sort of gathering the diaspora, the global diaspora together. But it's not just sort of getting us all in the tent and, us kind of sharing ideas between ourselves. I think the bigger opportunity is once we have that critical mass of, the best of what, Africa has to offer, the best of what the diaspora has to offer, then we now have the ability to have these conversations with other networks. And I think there'll be opportunities to partner in terms of technology, in terms of, sharing ideas, in terms of funding and financing, right? There are huge opportunities to invest in Web3 in sub-Saharan Africa. Part of the challenge is a lot of the large pools of money don't have access to those networks, don't have access to the people who natively understand these environments and can navigate them, right? So part of the opportunity for us is to sort of widen the tent in terms of collaboration with other networks that are like philosophically aligned with our vision and who also bring something to the table such that we can kind of, right? The whole point of Web3 is interoperability, right? The ability to kind of work with other people. And I think that's a massive opportunity for Afropolitan. And it's something we're definitely going to look into and emphasize.